This is the Memory Palace. I'm Nate DiMeo. So there was a time there, back in the 19th century, when hundreds of thousands, maybe even millions of Americans, maybe even something approaching most Americans, we can't entirely be sure, but there was a time there, and we are talking decades and decades, when these many people believed that some among them, the gifted, the blessed, could communicate with the dead. And there are people who think that now too, for sure. There are people who say they're mediums or channelers or psychics or whatever. And there are plenty of people who believe them. And that is what it is, but it is not what we're talking about here. I'm talking about spiritualism, a mass movement, a pervasive cultural phenomenon that was kick-started in 1848 when two sisters in a nothing town in upstate New York pretended that there was a ghost in their house. And then they just kept pretending and kept claiming straight-faced that they were conduits to the spirit world. I've told their story before, and I love their story, but this isn't their story. So anyway, the Fox sisters, Kate and Maggie, became famous, and then there were copycats all over the country. A lot of them were just cynical con artists, but others were sincerely seeking some new truth about the world and their place in it. And the public was fascinated, and there are a gajillion books out there, you could just Google them, that answered the big question: why did so many people believe in all this stuff? But I will ask another. Why wouldn't they want to? We all face loss and the fear of death at some points in our lives. But back then, it was just unrelenting. Folks just lost people all the freaking time then. To disease, and childbirth, to industrial accidents, to injuries that weren't treated correctly, to infection, to all sorts of things we can cure now or better defend against. Death was just a constant presence in people's lives. And then someone tells you that all the people you lost, all those people who've disappeared from your life, weren't gone at all. That the wall that divides us all eventually, the one that separates the living from the dead, is permeable. And that any time you could talk to your mother, who died giving birth to your sister, to the boy you loved who didn't come back from the war, to the child who didn't wake up one morning, or the father who'd slipped away before you got the chance to tell him that one thing, that thing you'd had to hold inside all these years. Spiritualism was a gift. And it was a tool. Because think of who else was out there. It's not just the people you know, it's anyone. Need some practical advice? Contact Ben Franklin. He's a smart guy, famously pragmatic. Are you a geometry student having trouble getting your head around the Pythagorean theorem? Well, then there is a certain dead Greek who can set you straight. Some mediums made a cottage industry out of contacting the famous dead. There's a book published in 1870 called The Ordeal of Life. It is a status report of sorts on the afterlives of 1,500 famous dead people, according to a medium in Rhode Island who checked in with them. They are listed alphabetically from Abraham, the patriarch of the Jewish people, to Huldrych Zwingli, who Wikipedia tells me played a big role in the Swiss Reformation. Each entry is a where are they now of sorts. And because the logic of the spirit world, according to these gifted souls out there exploring it and charting its contours, held that the dead went on about their lives once they moved on to a different plane. They could improve. Mozart, for instance, was making great progress in the spirit life, while John Milton had some work to do. And either the medium had some real connection to the other side. And I am skeptical of this because he contacts Odysseus and like dozens of other people who may not have actually ever existed. Or he was just using his supposed gifts to support whatever positions he held here among the living. Mediums did this all the time. They'd enlist the support of the dead in their various causes, to side with them in disputes. And so people came calling on John C. Calhoun. He was dead, having succumbed in 1850 to consumption, that most 19th century of fates. But prior to dying, he lived quite a life. He was a congressman from South Carolina, the vice president for 2 different administrations. And he was a terrible human being. He was a racist through and through. He was a slave owner of particular cruelty. And in his various vaunted positions, he did everything he could to perpetuate and expand slavery, such that he was the intellectual architect and central inspiration of what would become the government of the Confederacy. His friends said he was wise and nice to children, but let's not with that. He not only embodied the worst of America, he facilitated it. But at least a couple of prominent mediums, probably more, contacted John C. Calhoun, then a moldering in his grave. just as the nation was hurtling toward war down tracks he had gleefully laid in life. And it seemed, according to these mediums, that the dead senator had indeed made great progress in the spirit life. And in fact, had become enlightened on the other side, and renounced the evil practice of slavery, and called on his fellow white Southerners to free their slaves, and for their state governments to step back from the precipice of secession. Everything he'd said about the inferiority of the Negro race, every lash he'd ordered or delivered upon a human being he owned, every law he'd written that dragged the nation deeper and deeper into the darkness, every vile thing he'd said while he was alive, he'd grown since then. And he was calling backsies from the great beyond. And though this news was met with great interest, one abolitionist and spiritualist did point out that his statements may have had a bigger impact had he said them while he was still alive. Now, spiritualism, as a cultural force running through the mainstream of American life, died over time. And there are books about why. You can Google those too. But you can think of John C. Calhoun and his phony change of heart, and think of the mediums trying to imbue him in death with virtues he didn't have in life for their own political purposes. The next time you hear someone trying to make some dead Confederate out to be someone better than they were. This episode of The Memory Palace was written and produced in the like by me, Nate DiMeo, with engineering assistance from Elizabeth Aubert and research assistance from Eliza McGraw. This show is a proud member of Radiotopia, a network from PRX. We get ad-serving technology from AdZerk, and ad music composed by J.D. Sampson. As always, you can follow me on Twitter or Facebook at The Memory Palace, or you can drop me a line at nate@thememorypalace.us. Talk to you guys again.
Radiotopia.